Power corrupts, but absolute power creates monsters. In the blood-soaked arena of ancient Rome, one man, intoxicated by his own self-importance, believed himself to be simultaneously emperor and god, gladiator and divine being. His name was Commodus, and his reign transformed what was then the greatest empire in history into a macabre spectacle, a theater of the absurd where citizens were forced to genuflect before a megalomaniac who fancied himself Hercules, while Rome's foundations crumbled beneath his sandaled feet. This is the chilling saga of how the son of a philosopher morphed into the most reviled ruler in Roman annals, his delusions of grandeur culminating in a violent demise within the confines of his own bathtub. The Chronicle of Commodus exposes the abyss of human depravity when unchecked authority collides with profound mental instability. His is not merely a narrative of political ineptitude, but a psychological odyssey into the darkest recesses of the human psyche, an odyssey that serves as a timeless cautionary legend about the inherent perils of absolute dominion. From the resplendent marble halls of the Imperial Palace to the gore-drenched sands of the Colosseum, we will bear witness to how a prince, groomed to shepherd an empire, instead opted to obliterate it in pursuit of his warped vision of divinity. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire occupied the zenith of its power and cultural prowess. Under the stewardship of the 5 good emperors, Rome had enjoyed an era of unparalleled peace, prosperity, and territorial expansion. The last of these enlightened rulers was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations on Stoicism would resonate through Western intellectual history for millennia. Yet, even this paragon of wisdom committed a fateful error that would ultimately seal the empire's fate. He defied tradition and designated his biological son, rather than an adopted meritorious heir, as his successor. The year was 161 AD when Commodus Lucius Aurelius was ushered into a world of unimaginable privilege. As the scion of Marcus Aurelius, he was destined from birth to command over 50 million subjects spanning 3 continents. The Roman Empire of his formative years stretched from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-baked plains of the Euphrates, from the fortified banks of the Rhine to the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert. Trade routes forged pathways between distant lands. Roman law provided a framework for diverse populations, and Roman legions enforced the Pax Romana, a hard-won peace that had brought stability to the known world. However, beneath this shimmering veneer of gold and glory, the empire was beginning to exhibit subtle yet ominous cracks. Barbarian tribes exerted increasing pressure along the northern frontiers. Economic strains arose from protracted and costly military campaigns, and the traditional Roman virtues that had underpinned the empire's ascent were gradually eroding like ancient statues exposed to relentless winds. The stage was set for either a resurgence of Roman strength or a descent into irreversible catastrophe, and everything hinged upon the character of the emperor who would inherit this precarious legacy. Regrettably, that emperor would prove to be a young man captivated more by the allure of personal fame than by the weighty responsibilities of imperial governance, more enthralled by the barbaric pageantry of the arena than by the intricate nuances of statecraft. Marcus Aurelius had devoted a significant portion of Commodus's childhood to campaigning along the Danube frontier, battling Germanic tribes in the protracted and brutal Marcomannic Wars. The young prince accompanied his father on these campaigns, affording him a first-hand glimpse into the raw violence and unbridled chaos of warfare. Some historians posit that these early encounters with savagery may have profoundly influenced Commodus's later fixation on violence and spectacle. While his father contemplated the profound philosophical implications of leadership and mortality amidst the carnage, the young prince seemed to be drawn instead to the immediate gratification of raw power and the intoxicating sensation of dominance over others. The Roman system of governance, while outwardly presenting an image of monolithic imperial authority, was in reality a delicate and complex interplay between the emperor, the Senate, the military establishment, and the Roman populace. Previous emperors who had proven successful had grasped this intricate balance and meticulously navigated its complexities. But Commodus would demonstrate a profound incapacity for such nuance and diplomacy. His approach to rule would be defined by a crippling paranoia, unchecked excess, and an almost pathological craving for adoration that would ultimately precipitate his downfall. When Marcus Aurelius succumbed to illness in 180 AD during a military campaign along the Danube, the 18-year-old Commodus inherited not merely a throne, but the collective wisdom and immense responsibilities accumulated over centuries of Roman leadership. The transfer of power was remarkably seamless, as the legions and the Senate had already recognized him as co-emperor alongside his father. Initially, there was a flicker of hope that the youthful ruler might emulate his father's example, seamlessly blending philosophical acumen with pragmatic governance. These optimistic expectations, however, would prove to be tragically unfounded. Commodus's initial act as sole emperor offered a revealing glimpse into his true priorities. Rather than persevering in his father's military campaigns against the Germanic tribes' campaigns that were teetering on the brink of securing Rome's vulnerable northern frontier, he swiftly negotiated a hasty peace treaty and promptly returned to the opulent luxuries of Rome. This decision, while undoubtedly popular among the war-weary soldiers stationed along the frontier, betrayed his fundamental misunderstanding of imperial responsibility. The barbarian threat had not been eradicated, merely deferred, and future emperors would be compelled to pay a heavy price for Commodus's short-sighted eagerness to abandon the rigors of frontier warfare. Back in the decadent splendor of Rome, the young emperor rapidly revealed the contours of his true character. Unlike his predecessors, who had at least maintained the semblance of republican traditions, Commodus openly and unabashedly embraced autocratic rule. He summarily dismissed experienced advisors, brazenly disregarded the counsel of the Senate, and surrounded himself instead with a coterie of fawning flatterers and obsequious sycophants who shamelessly fueled his burgeoning megalomania. The imperial court, once a hallowed center of intellectual discourse and administrative efficiency, degenerated into a garish theater of excess, intrigue, and pervasive paranoia. The emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable as he solidified his grasp on power. He demanded elaborate ceremonies of obeisance, insisted on being addressed with extravagant divine titles, and initiated the systematic persecution of anyone whom he perceived as a potential threat to his absolute authority. Senators who had faithfully served under Marcus Aurelius found themselves suddenly under suspicion, their loyalty questioned, their families placed in jeopardy. The delicate equilibrium that had sustained Roman stability for generations was being deliberately dismantled by a ruler who perceived conspiracy lurking in every shadow. Perhaps most tellingly, Commodus harbored an all-consuming obsession with the gladiatorial games. While previous emperors had sponsored these spectacles as a calculated means of maintaining public support and showcasing their imperial largesse, Commodus viewed them as something far more profoundly personal. He began to perceive the arena not merely as a tool of statecraft, but as his natural domain, a space in which he could ostensibly demonstrate his divine nature through acts of orchestrated violence and absolute domination. This infatuation would escalate into a consuming passion that would come to define his reign and ultimately contribute to his precipitous downfall. As Commodus consolidated his power, his behavior spiraled further and further away from the moorings of reality. He began to identify himself with a succession of Roman deities, initially Jupiter and Mars, but eventually settling upon Hercules as his primary divine persona. This was not merely the ceremonial adoption of honorific titles, as had been commonplace among previous emperors, but a genuine and deeply held belief in his own literal godhood. Court ceremonies were transformed into elaborate religious rituals where senators and high-ranking officials were compelled to worship Commodus as a living deity. The emperor's physical appearance was meticulously crafted to reinforce his preposterous divine claims. He donned lion skins to evoke the image of Hercules, brandished a massive club as his symbol of authority, and had his likeness imprinted on coins depicting him with the attributes of various gods. Palace slaves were rigorously trained to approach him with the obsequious reverence due to a divine being, prostrating themselves before him and speaking only when directly addressed. Anyone who failed to display adequate divine reverence faced swift and often brutal punishment, ranging from permanent exile to summary execution. Commodus's delusions extended beyond mere personal aggrandizement, encompassing a complete and radical restructuring of Roman identity centered around his own person. He brazenly renamed the months of the year after his various titles and epithets. September became Commodus, October became Invictus, November became Exupertorius, and December became Amazonius. The city of Rome itself was rechristened Colonia Commodiana, and the Senate was coerced into acknowledging him as the founder of a new golden age that purportedly surpassed even the remarkable achievements of Augustus. The emperor's paranoia intensified in direct proportion to his delusions of grandeur. He envisioned enemies lurking everywhere, interpreting any hint of independence or criticism as evidence of treasonous conspiracy. A whispered conversation between senators could be construed as proof of a secret plot. A delayed response to a summons could signify latent disloyalty. Even a failure to exhibit sufficient enthusiasm during his elaborate divine ceremonies could result in a sentence of death. The imperial court became a labyrinthine realm of constant terror, where survival depended not on competence or unwavering loyalty, but solely on the ability to feed the emperor's insatiable ego while simultaneously evading his ever-watchful and suspicious gaze. Religious observances throughout the empire were drastically altered to accommodate Commodus's outrageous divine pretensions. Traditional Roman festivals were modified to incorporate the worship of the living emperor, and new celebrations were created specifically to honor his supposed divine nature. Provincial governors were mandated to construct temples dedicated to his worship, and failure to demonstrate adequate devotion could result in immediate recall and execution. The ancient Roman tradition of posthumous deification was abandoned altogether in favor of immediate divine recognition for the living emperor. The Colosseum, Rome's most magnificent architectural achievement and enduring symbol of imperial power, became the primary stage for Commodus's most shocking displays of megalomania. Unlike previous emperors who had merely watched the gladiatorial contests from the safety of the imperial box, Commodus insisted on actively participating as a gladiator himself. This was not simply an eccentric hobby, but a central and indispensable component of his self-proclaimed identity as a god emperor. He fervently believed that by fighting in the arena, he was demonstrating his inherent divine nature and affirming his kinship with Hercules, who had also famously battled both mythical beasts and mortal men. Commodus's gladiatorial performances were meticulously choreographed spectacles, deliberately designed to showcase his purported invincibility while simultaneously minimizing any actual danger to himself. His opponents were typically slaves armed with blunt wooden weapons, wounded soldiers incapable of mounting an effective defense, or wild animals that had been deliberately drugged or weakened. The emperor, by contrast, fought with genuine weapons and gleaming armor, while his victims were afforded only the illusion of resistance. These grotesque exhibitions were presented to the Roman populace as tangible demonstrations of divine power, but everyone understood them for what they truly were: the sadistic fantasies of a madman wielding absolute power. The emperor's obsession with the arena extended far beyond his personal participation, encompassing a complete and utter reorganization of the games themselves. Traditional gladiatorial contests, which had at least preserved some semblance of skill and fair competition, were replaced with elaborate executions and mass slaughters meticulously designed solely for Commodus's personal entertainment. Criminals, prisoners of war, and political enemies were fed to ravenous wild beasts in increasingly creative and horrific ways. The emperor would often participate in these executions personally, wielding his bow with deadly accuracy to dispatch exotic animals brought from the far reaches of the empire. These gruesome spectacles came at an exorbitant cost to the imperial treasury. Commodus demanded the most exotic and ferociously expensive animals: lions from the savannas of Africa, bears from the dark forests of Germania, tigers from the jungles of India, and elephants from the distant lands beyond the known world. The logistics of capturing, transporting, and maintaining these creatures placed an enormous strain on the empire's already stretched resources. But the emperor remained utterly indifferent to such mundane economic concerns. When his advisors dared to suggest that such lavish expenditures were rapidly bankrupting the state, they were likely to find themselves scheduled as the next day's entertainment in the arena. The psychological impact of these displays on the Roman populace was profound, disturbing, and ultimately corrosive. Citizens who had once taken immense pride in their empire's remarkable achievements now witnessed their emperor behaving like a common criminal or a bloodthirsty wild beast. The dignity and gravitas that had characterized Roman leadership for centuries was replaced by the debasing spectacle of their ruler reveling in a macabre orgy of blood and gore. Many Romans began to lose faith, not just in their emperor, but in the entire imperial system that had allowed such a monstrous figure to ascend to absolute power. As Commodus's mental state continued to deteriorate, his simmering paranoia metastasized into a systematic reign of terror that permeated every level of Roman society. No one, regardless of their rank or past service, was immune from his ever-shifting suspicions. Senators who had served the empire faithfully for decades, military commanders who had won resounding victories for Rome, even members of his own immediate family found themselves living under the ominous shadow of imperial displeasure. The emperor's preferred method of dealing with perceived threats was swift, brutal, and utterly merciless execution, often preceded by unspeakable torture, and always accompanied by the complete confiscation of the victim's property and assets. The Senate, once the proud governing body of the Roman Republic and still theoretically a partner in imperial rule, degenerated into little more than a collection of terrified men, anxiously awaiting the moment when they would discover who would be the next victim of the emperor's insatiable wrath. Commodus would frequently attend Senate meetings in person, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the senators, searching for any telltale sign of disloyalty or disrespect. A senator who failed to applaud enthusiastically enough, who dared to ask an inconvenient question, or who simply caught the emperor's attention at the wrong moment, might find himself summarily arrested before the conclusion of the session. The emperor's vast network of informants and spies infiltrated every aspect of Roman life. Slaves were encouraged to inform on their masters, soldiers on their commanding officers, wives on their husbands. Anyone could become an agent of the imperial terror, and anyone could become its unsuspecting victim. The traditional Roman values of honor, loyalty, and unwavering duty were systematically corrupted as people quickly learned that their survival depended on ostentatiously demonstrating their devotion to the emperor while meticulously avoiding any action that might be construed as a challenge to his absolute authority. Commodus's methods of execution became increasingly elaborate, theatrical, and public. He derived perverse pleasure from forcing his victims to actively participate in their own gruesome demise, compelling senators to fight as gladiators against trained killers, forcing decorated military commanders to face enraged wild beasts in the arena, or compelling wealthy citizens to compete in rigged contests where defeat invariably meant death. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They gratified the emperor's sadistic impulses. They provided a gruesome form of public entertainment that distracted the populace from the empire's mounting problems. And they served as a chilling reminder of the dire consequences of daring to oppose the imperial will. The economic impact of this pervasive reign of terror was catastrophic. The constant confiscation of property from executed traitors initially provided a temporary surge of revenue for the imperial treasury, but it also systematically destroyed the underlying economic foundations of the empire. Wealthy families who had invested in trade, manufacturing, and agriculture found their assets seized on the flimsiest of pretexts. The inevitable result was economic paralysis, as no one dared to accumulate wealth that might attract the emperor's avaricious attention. Trade declined precipitously, tax revenues plummeted, and the empire commenced its slow but inexorable slide toward the financial collapse that would characterize the turbulent 3rd century crisis. By 190 AD, after a decade of Commodus's increasingly erratic and tyrannical rule, even his closest associates began to recognize that the emperor posed an existential threat not only to their personal survival, but also to the very survival of the empire itself. The conspiracy that would ultimately bring about his demise began to coalesce among the very individuals who knew him best and who stood to lose the most from his continued reign. Unlike the grand political conspiracies of earlier periods in Roman history, this plot was born not of lofty ideals about restoring the Republic, but of sheer desperation and the instinct for self-preservation. The central figure in the conspiracy was Latus, the Praetorian prefect who commanded the elite imperial guard. Latus had initially been one of Commodus's most ardent supporters, but the emperor's escalating paranoia had begun to focus on him as a potential rival. The prefect understood that his position, which had once been a guarantee of immense power and wealth, had now become a virtual death sentence. Commodus's established pattern of summarily executing his closest advisors meant that Laetus was living on borrowed time, and he knew that only the emperor's death could ensure his own survival. Joining Laetus was Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain who controlled access to the emperor and managed much of the day-to-day administration of the sprawling palace. Eclectus had witnessed firsthand the emperor's disturbing descent into madness and understood better than anyone how completely Commodus had abandoned any semblance of rational governance. The chamberlain had watched helplessly as friends and colleagues vanished into the emperor's dungeons, and he knew that his intimate knowledge of imperial secrets made him particularly vulnerable to the emperor's capricious suspicions. The third key conspirator was perhaps the most surprising of all, Marcia, Commodus's favorite concubine, and one of the very few people who seemed to exert any discernible influence over him. Marcia had initially used her position to temper some of the emperor's worst excesses, secretly warning potential victims of his wrath and occasionally convincing Commodus to show unexpected mercy. However, she had recently discovered that her own name had appeared on one of the emperor's notorious death lists, and she realized that even her intimate relationship with him could no longer guarantee her safety. The conspirators understood that any attempt to remove Commodus from power would have to be meticulously planned and swiftly executed. The emperor was heavily guarded by the Praetorian Guard, surrounded by loyal slaves and freedmen, and constantly vigilant for any sign of treachery. Moreover, any failed attempt would result not only in their own agonizing deaths, but in a renewed reign of terror that would consume hundreds, if not thousands, of additional victims. They would have only a single opportunity to act, and failure would mean the utter destruction of everyone they held dear. The final catalyst for action came when the conspirators uncovered the full extent of Commodus's audacious plans for the upcoming new year. The emperor intended to appear as consul on January 1st, 193 AD, not clad in the traditional senatorial garb, but brazenly attired as a gladiator. This ultimate humiliation of Roman dignity would be followed by even more extravagant displays, including his long-contemplated plan to permanently relocate from the opulent palace to the squalid gladiator barracks and to rule the vast empire directly from the blood-stained sands of the arena. The conspirators realized that if they failed to act immediately, there might never be another opportunity to salvage Rome from its descent into utter madness under the rule of its mad emperor. The final weeks of 192 AD found Commodus at the zenith of his megalomania, utterly detached from the mundane realities of governing a sprawling empire and completely absorbed by his elaborate plans for demonstrating his self-proclaimed divine nature. He devoted his days to meticulously planning new spectacles for the arena, designing ever more outlandish costumes that would emphasize his identification with Hercules, and compiling increasingly long lists of enemies to be summarily eliminated in the coming year. The emperor seemed blissfully unaware that his own trusted associates were secretly plotting against him. Despite his habitual paranoia about potential threats, Marcia, with her unique and intimate access to the emperor, served as the primary source of intelligence for the clandestine conspiracy. She provided detailed reports on Commodus's daily routines, his security arrangements, and, most importantly, his increasingly volatile mental state. The concubine had observed that the emperor's behavior was becoming even more erratic and unpredictable than usual, characterized by sudden and violent mood swings that could transform him from a jovial companion to a homicidal maniac in a matter of moments. These invaluable observations helped the conspirators to refine their approach and meticulously time their decisive action. The emperor's declining physical condition also played a significant role in the conspirators' calculations. Years of unbridled excess, both in terms of rich food and copious wine consumption, as well as the surprisingly strenuous physical demands of his gladiatorial performances, had taken a visible toll on Commodus's overall health. While he remained a formidable physical presence, he was no longer the lithe and athletic young man who had inherited the throne 12 years earlier. The conspirators believed that if they could catch him at the right moment, his legendary strength might not be enough to prevent his imminent demise. Laetus skillfully utilized his position as Praetorian prefect to subtly adjust the security arrangements surrounding the emperor. Key guards who were known for their unwavering loyalty to Commodus were quietly reassigned to less sensitive posts. Trusted centurions were dispatched on convenient missions outside the city, and the overall protection of the imperial person was strategically weakened without arousing suspicion from the emperor or from those guards who remained steadfastly loyal to him. These changes had to be implemented gradually and organically to avoid triggering alarms from either the emperor himself or from the remaining loyal members of the Praetorian Guard. The conspirators also had to carefully consider the aftermath of their audacious actions. Simply assassinating Commodus would not be sufficient if it plunged the empire into a bloody civil war or led to the wholesale collapse of the imperial system. They needed to have a credible successor ready and broadly acceptable to the major power centers of the empire: the Senate, the military establishment, and the volatile populace of Rome. Their carefully considered choice was Pertinax, an elderly senator known for his impeccable reputation, his extensive military experience, and his unwavering commitment to public service. Pertinax was not directly involved in the conspiracy, but the plotters believed that he would reluctantly accept the purple if it were offered to him as the only viable alternative to prolonged chaos. On December 31st, 192 AD, as Rome braced itself to celebrate the dawn of a new year, the meticulously planned conspiracy finally moved into its climactic final phase. The plan was deceptively simple. Marcia would poison Commodus during their private evening meal, making his death appear natural and thus avoiding the dangerous complications that would inevitably arise from an overtly public assassination. The concubine had secured a slow-acting poison that would subtly mimic the symptoms of a sudden and unexpected illness, giving the conspirators ample time to solidify their plans for the succession before news of the emperor's death became widely disseminated. The poisoning initially proceeded according to the conspirators' carefully laid plans. Commodus unwittingly consumed the tainted wine during dinner and soon began to experience the initial symptoms of illness, though he casually attributed his growing discomfort to excessive eating and drinking during the day's festive celebrations. Marcia artfully encouraged him to rest, suggesting that he take a soothing, warm bath to ease his stomach troubles. The emperor, feeling increasingly nauseous and weak, readily agreed to her suggestion and made his way to the private baths connected to his imperial chambers. However, the poison was not acting as swiftly as the conspirators had anticipated. Instead of lapsing into unconsciousness or dying quietly in his sleep, Commodus began to vomit violently, purging a significant portion of the poison from his system. As his head cleared slightly, the emperor's deeply ingrained paranoid instincts reasserted themselves, and he began to suspect that he had been deliberately poisoned. In his weakened but still undeniably dangerous state, he frantically called for his guards and demanded to know who had access to his food and wine. Realizing that their carefully constructed plan was rapidly unraveling and that discovery was imminent, the desperate conspirators were forced to improvise. Latus swiftly dispatched a coded message to Narcissus, a renowned professional wrestler and gladiator trainer who had been discreetly recruited to the conspiracy as a crucial backup plan. Narcissus was instructed to enter the emperor's chambers immediately and complete the assassination by any means necessary. The wrestler understood that failure would mean a gruesome death for all of them, and he moved with purposeful speed through the palace corridors toward the imperial baths. Commodus, weakened by the insidious poison, but still a formidable physical specimen, was relaxing in his bath when Narcissus unexpectedly appeared. The emperor immediately understood what was happening and frantically tried to call for assistance, but his voice was raspy and weakened, and the sound of rushing water effectively masked his desperate cries. Narcissus, a powerful man trained in the brutal art of close-quarters combat, wrapped his massive hands around the emperor's throat and forcefully held him underwater. The ensuing struggle was brief but intensely violent, with Commodus thrashing desperately in the confined space of the bathtub, his preposterous divine pretensions rendered utterly meaningless by the cold reality of mortal flesh and the inexorable pressure of human hands constricting his windpipe. The death of Commodus was initially shrouded in secrecy, while the conspirators worked feverishly to orchestrate a smooth and seamless transition of power. Latus and Eclectus approached Pertinax, the elderly senator they had secretly chosen as the next emperor, and presented him with a stark and unavoidable choice: either accept the imperial purple or face the unmitigated chaos that would inevitably ensue if the succession remained unresolved. Pertinax, fully understanding the gravity of the situation and the severely limited options available to him, reluctantly accepted the enormous responsibility of ruling an empire that had been profoundly damaged by 12 long years of madness and tyranny. When news of Commodus's death finally became public, the reaction throughout the empire was undeniably mixed, but generally positive. In Rome, the Senate immediately condemned his memory, ordering that his statues be destroyed, his name be erased from public monuments, and his legacy be expunged from the historical record. The city that had been so audaciously renamed Colonia Commodiana swiftly reverted to its ancient name of Rome, and the months that had been shamelessly renamed after the emperor's grandiose titles returned to their traditional designations. The extravagant gladiatorial spectacles that had consumed so much of the imperial treasury were drastically scaled back to more reasonable and sustainable levels. However, the deep wounds inflicted during Commodus's disastrous reign could not be easily healed. The imperial treasury was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The once invincible military had been weakened by years of systematic neglect and politically motivated purges, and the administrative apparatus of the empire had been profoundly corrupted by an atmosphere of pervasive fear and sycophantic subservience. Pertinax, despite his commendable intentions and his extensive experience in both military and administrative affairs, would rule for a mere 87 days before being brutally murdered by disgruntled Praetorian guards who had grown accustomed to the atmosphere of unchecked chaos and unprecedented opportunities for personal profit that had characterized the previous reign. The assassination of Pertinax triggered the tumultuous Year of the Five Emperors, a period of intense civil war and debilitating instability that would vividly demonstrate how thoroughly Commodus had undermined the fundamental foundations of imperial stability. The avaricious Praetorian Guard brazenly auctioned off the imperial office to the highest bidder. Provincial armies marched on Rome to install their own chosen candidates on the throne, and the empire teetered precariously on the brink of complete and irreversible collapse. While order was eventually restored under the iron rule of Septimius Severus, the dangerous precedent of military intervention in imperial succession had been firmly and irrevocably established. The tragic story of Commodus serves as one of history's most vivid and cautionary illustrations of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, transforming a young man born to unparalleled greatness into a monstrous tyrant who nearly succeeded in destroying the very civilization he was entrusted to protect. His reign serves as a stark reminder of the inherent fragility of even the most powerful institutions when placed in the hands of someone who fundamentally lacks both the moral character and the unwavering mental stability necessary for effective leadership. The Roman Empire, which had seemed virtually unshakable at the height of its power and influence, was brought to the precipice of ruin by the unchecked megalomania and pervasive paranoia of a single individual. Perhaps most disturbingly, Commodus's deeply ingrained delusions of divinity blinded him to the immutable reality of his own mortality and inherent vulnerability. He fervently believed himself to be a god incarnate, yet he died like any mortal man, strangled in a bathtub by the hands of a servant, his preposterous divine pretensions offering absolutely no protection against the ultimate and inexorable democracy of death. His final moments, gasping desperately for air underwater while his assassin's relentless grip tightened around his throat, provide a stark and haunting reminder that no amount of power, wealth, or self-delusion can ever alter the fundamental realities of human existence. The conspiracy that ultimately ended Commodus's reign of terror was not driven by noble ideals about restoring republican government or enacting sweeping reforms to imperial administration, but by the simple and primal desire for personal survival. The men and women who conspired to kill him were not idealistic heroes, but desperate individuals who understood that their own lives depended entirely on eliminating a ruler who had become a mortal threat to everyone around him. This rather prosaic motivation makes their audacious actions no less historically significant, but it does serve to illustrate how thoroughly Commodus had corrupted the very political system that had produced him. The legacy of Commodus extends far beyond the boundaries of his own tumultuous reign, serving as a timeless, cautionary tale that has resonated throughout history whenever absolute power has been concentrated in the hands of unstable and unscrupulous individuals. His story reminds us that the institutions and traditions that safeguard civilization are far more fragile than they appear, and that the price of preserving them is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit power for personal gratification rather than dedicating themselves to selfless public service. In the end, Commodus undeniably achieved a form of immortality, but not the divine remembrance he so desperately craved. Instead, he is remembered as one of history's most notorious examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, a ruler whose name has become synonymous with megalomania, cruelty, and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked authority. His ignominious death in that Roman bathtub, strangled by desperate conspirators who could no longer endure his all-consuming madness, remains a potent symbol of how even the mightiest of rulers can fall when they lose sight of their own shared humanity and the profound responsibilities that inherently accompany power. The mad emperor who imagined himself a god died as mortal men have always died, alone, afraid, and utterly powerless to prevent his own inevitable destruction. So what can we take away from the tragic story of Commodus? It's a powerful, albeit chilling, illustration of how unchecked authority, especially when coupled with instability, can corrupt even those born into positions of immense privilege. It really highlights the importance of humility, responsibility, and a constant awareness of our own fallibility, especially for those in positions of power. It serves as a timeless reminder that the true strength of a society lies not just in its laws and institutions, but also in the character and integrity of its leaders. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What aspects of Commodus's reign did you find most striking? Do you see any parallels between his story and events in more modern times? Feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm always eager to read your perspectives and engage in a discussion. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker corners of Roman history, please consider subscribing. That way, you won't miss out on future explorations of fascinating historical figures and events. Thanks for watching.